I was flying over the desert in my light aircraft, enjoying the silence and the endless sea of sand stretching to the horizon. In such moments, time seems to stand still, and you become part of this ancient, almost mystical landscape. The orange disk of the sun slowly sank below the horizon, painting the sands in shades of gold and crimson. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound that reverberated through the vibrations of the aircraft. The engine began to sputter and cough, like an old man tired of a long journey. My thoughts fluttered like restless birds. Something was wrong. The engine died, and the plane, deprived of its soul, began to slowly lose altitude. I felt the world around me freeze, and time stretched like a rubber band. The sands below turned into a moving carpet waiting to embrace me. The plane, which had previously flown confidently through the sky, now seemed like a helpless toy forgotten in the hands of a child. I pulled the control stick towards me, trying to stabilize the descent. At that moment, all my senses sharpened to the extreme. I could only hear my own breathing, heavy and intermittent, and the faint hissing of the wind, like the whisper of an ancient creature. The sands were approaching faster, and I knew that the collision was inevitable. Seconds lasted forever. I recalled all my dreams, unfulfilled desires, and lost opportunities. I remembered the faces of those I loved and those I had lost. The plane shook, and I felt cold sweat trickle down my forehead. The ground was approaching, and in the last moment I closed my eyes, trusting fate and my instincts. The impact was softer than I expected. The sand embraced me like an old friend hugging and absorbing. The plane thudded into the dunes, leaving a long trail behind it. Opening my eyes, I saw the sun finally disappear behind the horizon, leaving me alone with the quiet, soothing whisper of the desert. I crawled out of the cockpit, feeling my feet sink into the soft, warm sand. Around me there was a silence so deep and all-encompassing that it seemed almost alive. The sky was gradually darkening, turning shades of indigo and violet, and the first stars were appearing, like the eyes of ancient gods watching me from eternity. I was glad to be alive. Amazingly, after such a fall, I remained intact and unharmed. Breathing in the hot, dry desert air, I realized that now I needed to think about what to do next. I began to recall the rules of survival in the desert. First of all, I needed to find shelter from the sun, stock up on water, and not waste energy unnecessarily. Evening was the perfect time to start moving, while during the day I needed to shelter from the scorching sun. I examined the plane, hoping to find something useful. In the cockpit, I found several bottles of water, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, and some food, canned goods and energy bars. At the bottom of the bag lay a compass and a map. These items could help me survive and find my way to civilization. Deciding that I needed to move, I recalled the map. According to it, there was a small oasis to the east, which could be my salvation. I knew it would be difficult, but staying in one place would be even more dangerous. The sun was already setting, and the desert was cooling down, becoming a bit more friendly. A long and arduous journey lay ahead, but now I had a goal and hope for salvation. The journey was exhausting. The desert, like an endless sandy ocean, stretched before me, consuming my strength and will. I walked, trying to conserve water, but it still disappeared quickly, like sand slipping through fingers. Every drop seemed precious, but I felt thirst gradually creeping up on me, like a predator waiting to strike. The sand underfoot was hot even at night, as if retaining the heat of the day. I walked, leaving barely noticeable traces behind me, which the wind immediately erased, as if everything I did was meaningless. The sky above was black, dotted with stars that seemed distant and indifferent to my suffering. The moon, like a silent observer, illuminated my path, but its light brought no comfort. With every step, I felt my strength waning. I began to notice that the sand dunes seemed higher and my legs felt heavier. I periodically stopped to take a sip of water and catch my breath. The water, warm and murky, seemed like liquid gold, but there was too little of it, and I knew it would soon run out. Gradually, despair began to overwhelm me. It seemed the desert was endless, and I would never reach my goal. The wind, raising the sand, whispered in my ear like an ancient language I could not understand, but which told me I was alone and abandoned in this silent world. Each step was difficult, each breath painful. I tried to keep the map in mind, on which I saw the oasis to the east, but with each passing hour, that image became more and more elusive. I imagined the cool waters and the shade of palm trees, but reality was different. Hot sand, dry air, and exhausting heat even at night. And yet, despite the despair, I kept going. Maybe it was an instinctive drive to live, maybe something more. But I knew one thing: stopping meant the end. So I continued my journey through this endless desert, guided by a thin thread of hope that somewhere ahead there was salvation, water, and life. At night, when my strength had almost left me, I suddenly noticed a light in the distance. It flickered like a lone star that had escaped from the sky's darkness and found its place among the sandy dunes. My heart beat faster, filled with hope. I rushed towards it, forgetting about pain and fatigue, as if this light was my last chance for salvation. As I approached, the light began to fade and soon disappeared entirely. I stopped, overwhelmed with despair, ready to give up again. But then, under the moonlight, I saw a huge structure. It towered over the dunes like a ghost from the past. An old lighthouse, standing in the middle of the desert. I slowly approached, tormented by thoughts of whether I had gone mad. But the lighthouse did not disappear. It stood there as an undeniable reality in this strange world. When I nearly reached it, my attention was drawn to movement at the top of the lighthouse. Something crawled out of its top and, deftly jumping down the wall, descended. The creature looked like a wolf, but there was something in its movements that was unnatural and inhuman. Werewolf, I thought, not believing my eyes. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly jumped behind the nearest dune, trying to hide. A fear gripped me that I had never felt before. There was something so alien and sinister in this creature that its presence alone caused terror. It sniffed the air, seemingly catching my scent, and headed toward the desert, leaving me in the shadow of the dune. I lay there, holding my breath, feeling cold sweat trickle down my forehead. I slowly approached the tower, fearing the return of that monster. But curiosity got the better of me, and I had no other options. Perhaps there was water here, which could save my life. Every step felt like an eternity, and every rustle made my heart skip a beat. The lighthouse, towering over the dunes, looked mysterious and ominous at the same time. Its old walls were covered with strange inscriptions and frescoes depicting scenes from the past. Reaching the lighthouse, I saw a massive wooden door half buried in sand. Symbols were carved on it which I couldn't understand, but which seemed ancient and magical. I cautiously pushed the door, and it opened with a soft creak. Inside, the lighthouse was dim, illuminated only by the moonlight streaming through narrow windows. I climbed a spiral staircase leading upwards. The steps were worn and creaked underfoot, as if they could no longer bear the weight of time. Along the walls of the lighthouse, I noticed more frescoes and writings telling of strange rituals and creatures resembling werewolves. My mind wandered between reality and fantasy as I climbed higher and higher. Finally, I reached the top. At the top was a small room with round windows through which moonlight flooded the space. In the center of the room was something resembling a well, around which a chain was stretched. A soft, mysterious light emanated from it, illuminating the room with a ghostly glow. The well seemed ancient, and its walls were lined with stones covered in moss and mysterious symbols. I approached closer, peering into the depths of the well. The light came from somewhere inside, like an underground fire or an ancient crystal emitting its glow. A chain led down, which could be used to descend, and I felt a strange pull, a call that lured me inside. While I was looking around, a sudden noise outside made me freeze. Looking out of one of the round windows, I saw the werewolf, the same one that had frightened me earlier, slowly approaching the lighthouse. It moved gracefully, like a shadow sliding over the sand dunes. My heart beat faster, and I felt fear engulf me. I realized that I was done for if I didn't find a way out. Looking around for an escape, I realized that my only option was to descend the chain into the well. I didn't know why I decided to do it. Maybe desperation pushed me to this step. I grabbed the cold metal of the chain and began to slowly climb down, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Descending, I found myself in a cave which was illuminated by a soft, mystical light emanating from strange stones embedded in the walls. The stones glowed like fireflies, creating an atmosphere of something magical and ancient. I felt the cold air streaming from the depths of the cave and heard the echo of my footsteps, bouncing off the walls, adding a surreal touch to everything that was happening. Suddenly, I heard sounds from above. The werewolf had begun descending after me. Panic overtook me, and I ran through the cave, not knowing where the path would lead. The stones underfoot were slippery and uneven, and every step was a struggle. The light from the glowing stones showed me the way, but also cast eerie shadows that seemed alive. I ran, feeling the cold air burn my lungs. Ahead, the cave split into two paths, and I instinctively chose the right one, hoping it would lead me to safety. The noises from above grew louder, and I knew the werewolf was closing in on me. Every step echoed loudly in my ears, making it seem like I was running not just from the creature, but from my own fears as well. The cave led me deeper, and I felt time losing its meaning. The stones lighting the way grew brighter, creating intricate patterns on the walls that looked like ancient writings. I tried not to think about what might lie ahead, focusing only on surviving and avoiding the fate the werewolf had in store for me. I kept running, feeling fear and adrenaline coursing through me. The cave seemed endless, and each step echoed loudly. Suddenly, something hard and heavy struck me on the head. My legs buckled, and I felt the world around me fade into darkness. When I awoke, I found myself in a small room. The walls were rough stone, damp and covered in moss. The only light came from glowing crystals embedded in the walls, emitting a soft bluish glow. There were rough but neatly made mats on the floor, and in the corner stood a low table carved from stone. Nearby, a girl and a boy, clearly from an ancient tribe, were sitting. Their clothes were made of thin fabric and woven materials adorned with intricate patterns. The girl, with long black hair braided into plaits and dark, perceptive eyes, looked at me with interest. The boy, with short hair and strong features, appeared wary but not hostile. They spoke in a language unfamiliar to me, melodic and rhythmic, sounding like the whisper of the wind through trees. I couldn't understand what they wanted from me, but their expressions showed neither malice nor threat. They studied me as if I were something unknown and mysterious. Soon the girl brought me food. It was a strange mix of mushrooms prepared in an unusual way, with a light aroma of herbs and spices. I ate slowly, feeling my strength gradually return. The water they gave me was cool and fresh, like a sip of a life-giving elixir. After the meal, they began asking me questions again, which I didn't understand. Their voices were calm, but I sensed they wanted to know something important. Unable to explain myself, they eventually left, leaving me alone in the stone room. I lay there, pondering what had happened and what to do next. My head still ached slightly from the blow, but my mind was clearing. I was deep underground, among these mysterious people, and didn't know how to escape. The boy returned shortly after I was left alone. He gestured for me to follow him, and I had no choice but to comply. We walked through a narrow corridor carved into the stone, and soon I found myself at the threshold of an exit. What I saw when we stepped outside made me freeze in shock. Before me opened a vast cave, the size of an entire valley. Its ceilings rose high, disappearing into the dimness, and huge crystals glimmered on the ceiling, emitting a soft, mysterious light. They illuminated everything around, bathing the cave in a ghostly glow that made everything look surreal, almost magical. I felt my legs buckle and nearly fell. Before me stretched a huge city built right in this cave. The stone houses were adorned with patterns and symbols that seemed as ancient as the earth itself. Narrow streets wound between the buildings, leading to a central square where a majestic temple with soaring columns stood. Around me, life bustled. People dressed in ancient clothes of fabric walked the streets, talking, laughing, and going about their daily activities. The sounds of their voices echoed off the cave walls, creating the impression that I had entered another world, far from everything I had known before. The boy who brought me here looked at me with understanding. He seemed to expect such a reaction. I couldn't believe my eyes. This city, hidden deep underground, was a true marvel that defied all laws of reality. My feelings were a mix of awe, fear, and admiration. I felt small and vulnerable before this grand spectacle, but at the same time, I was filled with a sense of reverence for what I was seeing. This city seemed to exist outside of time and space, as something that had always been and always would be. We continued our path through the streets, and I couldn't stop looking around, absorbing every detail. The stone buildings, adorned with frescoes and bas-reliefs, told the stories of an ancient people. As we walked through the streets, I noticed something absolutely incredible. In pens, like sheep, they kept enormous insects. Their chitinous shells gleamed in the light of the crystals, and they slowly chewed on some blue things that looked like mushrooms. My attention was drawn to a man riding on the back of a giant beetle. Its emerald wings glistened, and long antennae twitched in time with its movements. This sight astounded me to my core. I stared at it, feeling as though I had entered some fantasy world where reality intertwined with the boldest dreams and fears. The world I had found myself in defied all the natural laws I knew. We continued our journey and soon approached a huge building resembling a temple. Its facade was carved from the same stone as the surrounding buildings, but was far more ornate. Majestic columns decorated with intricate carvings supported a massive pediment. The temple walls depicted scenes telling the history of the people living here. Humans and giant insects, magical rituals, and starry skies. In the center of the facade stood massive doors inlaid with crystals that glowed softly. These doors seemed like gateways to another world, hiding secrets and knowledge beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. I felt a sense of awe and reverence for this grand structure. As I entered the temple, I was enveloped in the soft glow of crystals embedded in the walls and ceiling. The interior space of the temple was majestic and mysterious. The walls were covered with frescoes depicting scenes from the life of the ancient tribe. Rituals, hunting, and dances under the stars. The patterns intertwined with symbols that seemed alive in this soft light. The air was filled with the scent of antiquity, as if time had frozen here. We walked down a wide corridor leading to the central hall. When we arrived, I saw a group of people sitting on a raised platform. Their clothes and decorations indicated high status. They scrutinized me, discussing something among themselves. I couldn't understand their language, but I sensed that the decision they would make would be important for me. After a brief consultation, one of them issued an order to the soldiers standing on either side of the hall. A sense of foreboding washed over me. The soldiers approached and, taking me by the arms, led me down another corridor. We stopped in front of a massive door carved from the same stone as the temple walls. One of the soldiers handed me a spear and pushed me through the door. I found myself in a vast cave that resembled an arena. High stone walls surrounded it on all sides, and these walls had seats filled with people. The light from the crystals reflected off the walls, creating ghostly shadows, making the place even more sinister. In the crowd, I noticed the elders I had seen earlier. They sat in honored places, their eyes fixed on me. To my horror, I realized that I was indeed in an arena. My heart beat faster, and adrenaline filled my body. The people in the stands began to make noise, their voices blending into a single hum that echoed off the walls. I gripped the spear tightly, feeling its cold metal in my hands, and looked around, trying to understand what lay ahead of me. Suddenly, the gates opposite me slowly opened, and I heard the grinding of metal and a thudding sound, like the footsteps of a giant creature. From the gates emerged a giant praying mantis, as tall as a human. Its delicate-looking body, covered in green chitin plates, glistened in the crystal light. Huge hollow eyes stared at me, and its powerful front legs with razor-sharp spikes moved slowly, preparing to strike. This creature seemed to embody ancient terror, a living nightmare ready to tear me apart. The mantis stepped forward, emitting a menacing sound, and I instinctively raised my spear. At that moment, everything around me seemed to freeze, and I focused solely on my opponent. The creature leaped at me with astonishing speed, and I barely managed to dodge, feeling the sharp spikes whistle past me. I struck first, aiming for the mantis's head, but its armor proved too strong, and the spear slid off without causing harm. The creature reacted instantly, turning and striking back with its front legs. I managed to shield myself with the spear, but one of the spikes deeply scratched my shoulder, leaving a long, bleeding wound. Pain shot through me, but adrenaline and survival instinct gave me strength. I stepped back, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The mantis leaped at me once more, and this time I managed to land a precise blow to its side. The spear pierced through the chitin, and the creature let out a piercing screech. Seizing the moment, I pulled the spear out and struck again, aiming for the mantis's chest. The creature staggered, and I could see its strength waning. However, it managed to deliver a final blow, hitting my leg and leaving a deep wound. I struggled to stay on my feet, but didn't allow myself to fall. Gathering all my strength, I made a final lunge and pierced the mantis's head, killing it for good. The creature collapsed to the ground, and I stood over it, breathing heavily and feeling blood trickle down my body. The people in the stands began to applaud and shout, their voices blending into a powerful roar. After my victory in the arena, the young man cautiously but resolutely led me out of the cave. He brought me to a small room where I received first aid. They laid me on a bed and began treating my wounds with local herbs and potions that surprisingly quickly relieved the pain and accelerated healing. A month passed, and I lived in a small house with the couple, gradually recovering from my injuries. I started learning the local language by pointing to objects and repeating the words they said. Languages came easily to me, and I slowly began to understand what was happening in this world. The girl was named Lyra, and the boy was Kai. They were siblings and became my first friends in this mysterious underground city. The city glowed with the soft light of crystals, which emitted a glow even at night, creating the illusion of a starry sky. I learned that when night falls on the surface, the crystals also dim, creating a semblance of a starry night in this underground world. It was a marvelous sight, giving the city a mystical atmosphere. My wound almost healed, and I began wandering around the city, learning about the local life. The main food here was mushrooms and beetle meat, which was surprisingly delicious. They also grew other plants from which they made clothes, furniture, and various items. Life in this city was surprisingly self-sufficient and harmonious. I learned that I was sent to the arena by the decision of the priest. He said that if I passed the trial, I would survive and become part of their society. But there was something else in his words that I couldn't fully understand. Perhaps they expected something more from me. While wandering around the city, I discovered many amazing things. In the central square, there was a huge fountain, from which not water but liquid light flowed, filling the air with a soft glow. People came to this fountain to drink and feel a surge of strength. I also discovered that the city had giant ants that acted as builders. They carried stones and other materials, creating new buildings and repairing old ones. These ants were domesticated and followed human commands, performing their work with astonishing precision. Another marvel was the flying fireflies, the size of a fist. They were used as living lanterns illuminating homes and streets. Their light was soft and warm, creating a cozy atmosphere in the evening. My rest didn't last long. One day, the chief summoned me. His face was serious, and his gaze was inscrutable. He said that their people needed my help to save them from an impending danger. I couldn't refuse, as spears were pointed at me. I sighed, realizing I had no choice, and agreed. I wanted to know what I was supposed to do. But instead of an answer, I was led into the temple. Lyra and Kai accompanied me, their faces tense but determined. We descended a wide stone staircase, illuminated by the light of crystals embedded in the walls. These crystals emitted a soft, bluish glow, casting intricate shadows on the stone slabs beneath our feet. The staircase spiraled deeper underground. The air grew cooler and heavier, filled with the scent of antiquity and moisture. Our footsteps echoed in the silence, creating the feeling that we were walking through an endless corridor of time, hiding its secrets in dark corners. Finally, we reached massive gates adorned with carvings and symbols I couldn't understand. They slowly opened with a loud creak, revealing a labyrinth. High stone walls stretched in various directions, hiding their secrets around the corners. The labyrinth was lit by the same crystals, but their light seemed dimmer and more sinister here. Lyra and Kai walked beside me. We took the first step into the labyrinth, and the gates closed behind us with a heavy thud, cutting off the way back. The walls of the labyrinth were covered with moss and strange patterns, as if they had a life of their own. The path became increasingly convoluted. The The stone walls with their patterns and ancient symbols seemed to shift before our eyes, disorienting us. Soon, we encountered the first obstacle, a massive stone door adorned with rows of mysterious signs. An inscription on the door was in an unfamiliar language, but logic and intuition told me it was a riddle to solve. I focused and began examining the symbols. My experience and knowledge of languages allowed me to see a clue in these signs. I noticed that one of the symbols appeared more frequently than the others and realized it was the key to the riddle. I touched the right symbol, and the door slowly opened, allowing us to proceed. We continued, and the labyrinth presented us with new challenges. The next obstacle was a room full of ancient traps. The stone slabs on the floor were dotted with small holes from which sharp spears emerged. We had to move slowly and carefully, avoiding the traps. I noticed that the patterns on the walls indicated a safe path, and by following them, we crossed the room unharmed. Further along, the path led us to another puzzle. On the wall were carved figures depicting the sun, moon, and stars. Kai translated the inscription. Only one who knows the order of the celestial bodies will pass. I thought of the cycles of day and night and realized that I needed to press the figures in a certain order. I pressed the sun first, then the moon, and finally the stars. The wall before us parted, revealing a new passage. We went further and deeper, feeling the labyrinth becoming increasingly hostile. Once, we found ourselves in a hall filled with water up to our ankles. Stone columns disappearing into the darkness created an eerie atmosphere. In the center of the hall stood a statue with outstretched hands holding an ancient book. As I approached it, the floor beneath me began to give way, and the water started to rise. I quickly grabbed the book, and a riddle on the cover hinted at the solution. I turned the statue clockwise, and the floor returned to its place, stopping the flood. Each trial was tense and exhausting. The traps and puzzles tested our endurance, but we progressed, thanks to my ability to solve the labyrinth's mysteries. Eventually, we reached massive gates adorned with symbols and carvings. Lyra and Kai looked at me, their faces expressing hope and fear. Behind the massive gates, an enormous room opened up, illuminated by a soft light emanating from an unknown source. The light was dim, casting shadows that danced across the walls adorned with ancient frescoes. In the center of the room stood a tall pedestal with a large glowing red crystal on top. Its glow filled the room with a mysterious atmosphere, as if it were the heart of this ancient place. In front of the pedestal was a narrow bridge spanning a deep chasm. The bridge was made of thin but strong vines that seemed capable of supporting only one person. This was the final trial, requiring not just bravery but trust. On the wall next to the bridge was an inscription that read, "Only one who is not afraid to entrust their life to another can cross this path." I realized that the trial involved one person crossing the bridge while the other stayed behind, holding a taut rope to keep the bridge from collapsing. It was a test of courage and trust. Lyra, Kai, and I exchanged glances. The decision was difficult, but we understood that we had no other choice. Lyra stayed at one end of the bridge, holding the rope, while Kai and I began to cross the narrow bridge. Every step was challenging. The vines beneath us creaked and swayed. I felt the bridge shift under my weight and knew that every step depended on Lyra's strength. When we reached the middle of the bridge, Kai paused for a moment, looked into my eyes, and said, "You must go first. We trust you." I nodded and, summoning all my courage, continued. Finally, I reached the other end of the bridge and helped Kai cross the last part. We both looked back at Lyra and she began to cross, holding onto the rope we had stretched. Her steps were confident and soon she joined us. We approached the pedestal and I carefully took the crystal. Its surface was warm and smooth and it emitted a powerful red glow. We knew this crystal was the key to saving their people. With the crystal in hand, we retraced our steps, overcoming all the obstacles and traps of the labyrinth once more. Each step was difficult, but now we had a goal and confidence in our success. The crystal glowed brighter, almost guiding us. When we returned to the main hall of the temple, we were greeted with excitement and joy. The priest, seeing the crystal, bowed his head in respect. The priest approached me and took the crystal from my hands. I thought he would begin some kind of ritual, but he suddenly smashed the crystal on the ground. I nearly swore, not understanding what he was doing, but those around us remained calm. The crystal shattered into equal rhombus-shaped fragments, and people immediately rushed to collect them. The next day, I was summoned again. When I arrived, I saw that everyone was armed with spears tipped with these crystal fragments. The chief approached me and handed me one of the spears. I took it and, turning it in my hands, realized it was well made and perfectly balanced. Lyra came over and began to explain. She told me that every 2 months, enemies came to kill their people. These enemies were invincible to regular weapons but vulnerable to the crystals. I asked who these enemies were, and Lyra answered, "Wolves." I remembered the creature at the lighthouse and felt a chill run down my spine. Lyra continued, explaining that the wolves were due to arrive that night. I could feel the tension in the air. The warriors decorated themselves, painting symbols on their faces in preparation for battle. Lyra offered to paint symbols on my face as well, and I agreed, feeling like part of their people. After the preparations, we went to the southern part of the city, where there were many passages and caves. These caves led to underground tunnels through which the werewolves could come. We took our positions, ready to defend the city. The warriors stood in silence, gripping their crystal-tipped spears, their faces focused and determined. Night fell over the city, and the light from the crystals embedded in the walls barely illuminated our positions. The silence was tense, like a tightly stretched string. The warriors held their breath, their spears at the ready, their faces focused and determined. The first sound to break the silence was a low growl from afar. Then shadows began to move among the houses. The werewolves, these terrifying wolves, moved stealthily, using the buildings as cover. Their eyes glowed with a sinister light, and each step was filled with menace. Suddenly, one of the werewolves lunged at us from around a corner. Its leap was lightning fast, claws gleaming in the crystal light. I raised my spear and barely managed to strike. The crystal penetrated its body, and the creature let out a piercing scream, collapsing to the ground. However, this was only the beginning. From other directions, new werewolves began to appear, attacking from cover. They moved quickly and silently, like shadows, and attacked suddenly from the most unexpected places. One of them lunged at a group of warriors, but Lyra, with surprising agility, sprang at it and drove her spear into its chest. The werewolf fell, but another one immediately took its place. I heard a scream from another direction and saw Kai fighting two werewolves at once. He was fending them off, landing precise blows, but his opponents were strong and fast. I rushed to help, striking one of the werewolves in the side. The crystal penetrated its flesh, and the creature fell, leaving Kai to deal with the remaining enemy. The battle raged throughout the city. The werewolves hid among the houses, using the shadows and narrow streets for attacks. They were smart and cunning, their attacks sudden and deadly. The warriors fought with desperate determination, defending their home and loved ones. The crystals, shining on the spear tips, were our only weapon against these monsters. I saw one of the warriors fall, struck down by a werewolf's claws, but another immediately took his place, delivering a fatal blow. We fought side by side, covering each other and repelling continuous attacks. At some point, I felt claws sink into my arm, but adrenaline and fury made me strike back, sending the werewolf to the ground. The battle was chaotic and bloody. The werewolves tried to break through to the central square, where the main fortifications were. We fought with all our might to prevent them from capturing the city. At one point, I saw Lyra fighting a huge werewolf, twice the size of the others. She dodged its blows with the grace of a dancer, landing quick and precise strikes. I hurried to her aid, and together we managed to bring down the beast. Eventually, the werewolves' assault began to wane. Their attacks became less organized, and we managed to push them back into the shadows from which they came. The last werewolf, wounded and exhausted, let out a long, ominous howl and fled. Silence fell over the city once again, broken only by the heavy breathing of the warriors and the whisper of the wind. We stood among the ruined houses and the bodies of fallen enemies, feeling the tension gradually subside. The warriors raised their spears with the crystal tips, their faces glowing with triumph and relief. Lyra approached me, her face covered in battle markings and drops of sweat. She quietly said, "We did it. We protected our home." After the victory, we went to celebrate. The warriors and the city's inhabitants gathered in the central square, which now seemed bright and lively thanks to the soft light of the crystals. Laughter and joy filled the air. People shared stories of the battle, thanked each other, and sang ancient songs. Soon the chief approached us with a noble and confident look. He held a cup with a drink and offered it to me as a sign of gratitude and recognition. I accepted, took the cup, and drank its contents. The taste was unusual but pleasant, and warmth quickly spread through my body. At that moment I noticed the faces of Lyra and Kai. Their eyes were full of sadness and anxiety. I wanted to ask what was wrong, but suddenly the world began to fade, and everything around me started to blur. The last thing I heard were the echoes of the celebration mixed with whispered voices. I woke up in the middle of the desert. A Bedouin was shaking me, trying to bring me to my senses. I lay in my clothes, completely bewildered, trying to understand where I was and what had happened. The Bedouin was asking something in his language, but I barely heard him. My thoughts were occupied with searching for Lyra and Kai. However, there was only the endless desert around me. Trying to collect my thoughts, I began to doubt the reality of everything that had happened. Maybe it was just a dream. Suddenly, I lifted my pant leg and saw a scar on my leg, the same one left after the battle with the mantis. The scar was real, a tangible proof that it had all happened. I realized that all my experiences, battles, and friends from the underground city were real, not just a figment of my imagination. This scar was a symbol that I had truly gone through the trials and become part of their world. Now, despite the desert around me, I knew my life had changed forever, and this experience had become an integral part of my existence. The Bedouin kept talking, and I finally paid attention to him. He helped me stand and offered me water. I thanked him, knowing that now I had to find my way in this world, never forgetting what had happened deep underground.